Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about the history of electronic music, specifically around after the 20s or 30s, and then progressing up to around 2000. So first, I'm going to go into the history of music technology, which is how people listened to music at the time. And in the 10s and 20s, radio started to become a pretty popular means of communication, and eventually music broadcasting became popular around the 20s. It was still very popular around up until the 60s, and then it remained still pretty popular up until today. There's still FM and AM radio going around, and there's couple other styles like shortwave radio, but overall it peaked in around the 60s, and after that had a gradual decline. In the 30s, there were jukeboxes. Not so much to say about that. Jukeboxes aren't really a thing anymore, but they kind of were a thing in the 30s and 40s. They were never too huge. Nobody was going out to a jukebox just to listen to music. It was if they had it at a spot, it would be nice, but otherwise wasn't a necessity. And then in 1948, the first vinyl was created, or at least the first vinyl that was available for home consumption, which became a pretty big deal. Phonographs were very popular from around the 50s to 80s, and after that they began to fall off, but for some people it was a kind of a way to get a more special relationship to an album, or a collector's kind of edition, so it still became a little bit popular, and you see them around sometimes. I literally have a vinyl behind my head right there, but definitely nowhere near as popular as it was from the 50s through 80s. Cassette tapes were around in the late 60s, and they kind of became more popular around the 80s. The main thing that kind of stopped their popularity is that right when they were really taking off, and kind of reaching their peak, CDs came out, which was around the 80s, and those were just much easier to use, so people just kind of switched to CDs. So cassettes had a pretty good run, but it was kind of taken over by CDs, which, as I said, started in the 80s. They became very popular in the 90s, and then peaked around 2000, and kind of had a falling off after that. Not many people use CDs today, but they're still kind of around. Then besides that, there was MTV, and then obviously in around the 2000s, streaming services became, and people were just downloading music, and now that is by far and away the most popular form of listening to music. Now moving on to technology that was used to create music. In 1965, the Graphic One was released, which was the first integration of graphics into the creation of sound and choreography, which is really cool because this is a precursor to modern day apps that use graphic workspaces and keyboard input to construct songs, such as Ableton Live, Logic, or Pro Tools. And these tools make a huge amount of modern day music, so this is really cool, as this was the initial first integration of visual inputs to creating music. Another very important thing, synthesizers, which is basically just an actual instrument, but it's fully technology. It's you push a button and it makes a sound. It's the first complete integration of technology as a instrument. And in 1951, the first synth was built for a radio station, which just wanted it to make it much easier to create sounds or create music on the fly for a radio show. At the start, synthesizers were huge and took up entire rooms, so they were mainly only used for radio shows, for I was saying, but only major studios were able to invest in one, so it wasn't available to the public. But in 1970, Moog, it was the largest synth company at the time for radio shows, created a smaller version, which was then marketed to actual consumers, and they were able to use it on their own. This was the first kind of portable synth, and this is actually the same kind of synth that people will use at DJ sets or concerts today, which is really cool that we're just using the same thing. Obviously the ones today are much more advanced and can do much more, but in 1970 this was the first one. It was called the Mini Moog. I think I forgot to mention that. Now I'm going to go into the actual history of electronic music. So electronic music began in Germany in the 50s, and the problem was that it was heavily limited by the technology. People weren't able to create the kinds of sounds and the progression of sounds that they actually wanted to. So as the technology progressed, so did electronic music, and it eventually spread to the United States. I'm going to go over some different genres and when they started and stuff like that. So jungle started in UK in the late 80s, and it was very, very drum centric. It was a lot of drum sounds. There wasn't too much melody or other stuff like that. It was just very fast drums and a lot of bass too. Connecting to that, it actually led to drum and bass, which became very popular in the US and Europe also. House music was a kind of dance music that started in the 80s in Chicago, actually. And one of its main features was repetitive kicks that gave it like a more dancey feel, and then also it incorporated a lot of more like different kinds of melodies, and then specifically there's some kinds of like house synths, which if you heard it you would know what I'm talking about. It's very noticeable, and it became very popular in the U.S. and influenced actually a lot of like popular music as well. Like even later down the line, like stuff like T-Pain, like that stuff is really influenced by house music, which is pretty cool. And then disco. Disco is electronic music, but it was kind of more of a precursor to another wave of electronic music which happened in the US later. But disco was mainly in the 70s, and kind of similar to house, it had a very like steady beat going, and it was pretty dance focused. And it also contained vocals, which none of the other ones that I'm talking about contain vocals. And then another kind of music was like bass or hardcore music, which was like very focused on, I mean, as you could probably guess, on the bass, and like that was the main part of it. Like there was some other stuff like a couple of drums, but mainly it was just like what sound design about the bass, and then like how you constructed it, and just generally what the bass sounded like. And connecting to that was hardcore, which is just like very extreme EDM, which kind of takes the bass because that's like the most in-your-face element of EDM, and then just like turns that up to the max. So they're kind of similar, and it kind of started in Europe and like Germany and Belgium in around the late 80s. Corresponding with the rise of electronic music was raves, which were basically like extreme dance parties that played dance music. People started calling dance shows raves in around the 80s, and they were mainly first focused in like London, and they were like underground dance shows that happened in London. And it's pretty cool because what happened is that they kind of developed their own subculture, and it became a little bit exclusive. Like people, like it wasn't like they weren't telling everybody where or when the shows was, and then even if you knew, were you able to get in? Like it was kind of like clubs where it was like there was an exclusive element to it, which made it more popular, honestly. And it spread to California in like the late 80s and became really popular in California as well. Now I'm going to go into a couple artists which should help like outline a couple of the trends that I was talking about. And all of the artists that I'm going to be discussing are extremely influential, so it's also just important to understand them if you want to understand electronic music. First of all, Orbital, which was an electronic duo who began in around the 80s. And it was actually, they kind of started out with the electronic movement itself. Like, it was the early 80s when they were starting out, which was... it wasn't like exactly at the start, but electronic music was still very young. Because the thing is, electronic music technically started in the 50s, but this was like people who were playing with machines. These were like technology focused people, because it was mainly about the technology, like how do you actually make a machine that sounds like actually listenable. And then it was around the 70s and 80s when it transferred from like, okay, how can we make the technology do this? Okay, like how can we use the technology to make good music? And Orbital was kind of at the forefront of that, at least in the UK. And especially dance music. They were like extreme pioneers in dance music. They kind of led it like to its popularity even. They like performed at a bunch of raves. They were pretty focused with that. I had iconic glasses that had lights on them, so like they would just be like nodding their head on stage, and that became like a really iconic image in the dance scene. Another artist was Raymond Scott, which is actually a lot earlier, and he started making music in like 1936, and he started out actually as a jazz artist. He was very connected to the Harlem Renaissance and stuff like that. He played piano for many years before actually going into music, and then later in his career he kind of switched to electronic music in around like the 50s, and a little bit later than that he became really popular. But it's just pretty cool to see how like different artists were incorporating electronic styles as it became more accessible. Moving on to Daft Punk, this is a lot later. They started making music in 1996, and you've probably heard of Daft Punk. They're very, very popular, but lots of dance elements. They had driving kicks, like similar to house music. They definitely made lots of house music, like Defunk, one of their early songs that's very house. They became ridiculously popular. I think I mentioned that they were French, but they started out in France. They became very popular. Their first album, Homework, was very successful, and they went on a huge tour around Europe, which spread, dance music to the masses, basically, and they became ridiculously popular. They influenced a lot of artists, like people like LCD Sound System, Tame Impala, Skrillex, and other people cite them as like a major influence. overall just very, very important to electronic music. Another artist, Aphex Twin, is an Irish musician who began making music in 1992, and they make a bit more experimental music. They blend styles from like jungle, house, and also a lot of ambient music. They never became too mainstream, but they did become fairly popular. Actually, very popular in the U.S. and then also in like Central Europe. And his music is really innovative. Most of it doesn't really fit in a genre, but you can kind of see like the inspiration that he takes from genres. His sound design is really amazing, and he has very, very incredible drums. It's really cool. Honestly, he makes some of my favorite music. He's very, very good. Okay, that's kind of it. I kind of discussed what electronic music is, how some different genres came about, and then specific artists. Yeah, overall, electronic music started around 50s, became more popular, branched out into subgenres, like kind of spread to America really in the 60s, but there were some people here doing stuff in the like 50s, and then led to disco, which then after that led to like other kinds of dance music like house and like drum and bass and stuff like that, and then became very popular. House music became ridiculously popular with Daft Punk and everything like that. Yeah, and yeah, that's basically it. Thanks for listening.